All right, let's jump right in. We're about to investigate one of the most influential, debated, and, honestly, mysterious books ever written, the Book of Daniel. For thousands of years, it's shaped the hopes and fears of millions. But behind its epic stories of fiery furnaces and lions' dens, there lies a profound historical whodunit.
And that gets us to the absolute heart of the matter, the question that has split scholars for centuries. Is the Book of Daniel a genuine record of divine prophecy, written by a prophet way back in the 6th century BC? Or is it a brilliant piece of literature from the 2nd century BC, what some might call a pious forgery, written long after many of its so-called predictions had already come to pass?
Believe me, the entire meaning of the book completely changes depending on the answer. If it was written in the 6th century BC, its visions are some of the most breathtaking, long-range predictions ever recorded. But if it was written 400 years later, it's a powerful work of political resistance, using the past to inspire hope for the future. The stakes just couldn't be higher.
So we have two main theories on the table. The traditional view says, yep, Daniel, an exile in Babylon, wrote this whole thing during the 6th century BC. Then you have the critical view, often called the Maccabean thesis, which argues that an unknown author wrote it around 165 BC to encourage Jews during a really, really bad time. So let's dig into the evidence for both sides.
First up, the traditional case. This view takes the book at its word, that it was written by its namesake, Daniel, a high-ranking official and prophet who served in the courts of Babylon and Persia all the way back in the 6th century BC.
So, what's the evidence for this? Well, for starters, the book itself flat out says Daniel's the author. It also contains these incredibly specific details about 6th century Babylonian life, like it mentions Belshazzar's co-regency with his father, a weird little fact that was totally lost to history for centuries until, boom, modern archaeology confirmed it. On top of that, you have other ancient sources, from the historian Josephus to Jesus himself in the New Testament, who all refer to Daniel as a real historical prophet.
And then there's this, the archaeological bombshell. Manuscripts of Daniel were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they proved that by the 2nd century BC, the exact same time critics claim it was being written, the book was already being copied and treated as ancient authoritative scripture. Supporters of the traditional view argue, come on, how could a text gain that kind of status so quickly? It must have been around for a very long time.
Okay, but now, let's flip the script and look at the counter-theory. This argument places the book's final version 400 years later. And this isn't a time of peace. It's a moment of intense crisis for the Jewish people under the brutal rule of a Greek king.
Now, to get this view, you have to know this Latin phrase, vaticinium ex eventu. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it just means prophecy after the event. This is the core idea right here, that the author of Daniel was actually writing history, not prophecy. They were describing things that had already happened, but they cleverly framed them in the future tense to make it look like an amazingly accurate prediction. So the kicker for this thesis is that the prophecies in Daniel seem incredibly laser-point accurate right up until the reign of a Greek king named Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 160s BC. And after that point, well, they get kind of vague, or according to critics, just plain wrong. This suggests an author who knew history up to his own time and then tried and failed to predict what came next. The book, in this view, was a form of resistance literature meant to give courage to persecuted Jews.
But you might be asking, why write under the name Daniel? This brings up another key concept, pseudonymity. You know, in the ancient world, it was actually a pretty common literary trick to write under the name of a famous, long-dead figure. By claiming the revered prophet Daniel as the author, this 2nd century writer gave their work instant authority and a ton of weight.
Okay, so we've got our two competing theories. Let's put them to the test. Let's see how each one interprets the famous, super cryptic visions that make up the heart of the book, because this is where the debate really heats up. So take the vision of the 4 great beasts, which everyone agrees represent 4 world empires. The traditional, historicist view identifies them as Babylon, then a unified Medo-Persian empire, followed by Greece, and finally Rome. Simple enough. But the critical view does something really interesting. It takes that single Medo-Persian empire and splits it into 2 separate kingdoms, first Media, then Persia. And this is a crucial move, because it bumps Greece into the 4th and final spot, neatly ending the prophecy right in the era of, you guessed it, Antiochus IV.
And this brings us to the next major disagreement. Who is the villain, the little horn? For those who hold the 2nd century view, this guy is, without a doubt, Antiochus IV. He fits perfectly.
He comes from the Greek Empire and he persecutes the Jews. But for the traditional view, the horn comes from the fourth beast, which they say is Rome, and its characteristics point to a much later power, like the medieval papacy, emerging long after Antiochus was history.
And what about the clock? The book gives these specific time periods, like 2300 evening mornings. The Maccabean thesis takes this literally. That's about 6.5 years, a time frame that could totally fit the crisis under Antiochus. The traditional view, though, sees this as symbolic time. They apply a day for a year principle, which transforms those 2300 days into 2300 times years, giving the prophecy a scope that stretches across millennia.
Now, critics of the 6th century date love to point out what looks like a glaring historical error right in the very first verse. Daniel says Nebuchadnezzar came in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim, but the prophet Jeremiah says it was the 4th year. Ouch. But this isn't necessarily an error. As you can see here, the Babylonians and the Jews used two different but equally valid systems for counting a king's reign. One used an accession year, the other didn't. When you account for this little difference, the apparent contradiction just vanishes. So, after all this historical back and forth about dating systems and little horns, why does any of it really matter today? Well, the answer to this historical whodunit fundamentally changes what the Book of Daniel actually is.
Think about it. If the book was really written in the 6th century BC, then it stands as this powerful, unique testament to the possibility of supernatural prophecy. It would mean its author accurately predicted the entire sequence of world empires, from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, centuries before any of it happened.
But if it was written in the 2nd century BC, the story is completely different. It becomes one of history's most successful works of resistance literature, a masterpiece of human ingenuity and faith, crafted to assure a persecuted people that just as God had controlled history in the past, he would absolutely deliver them in their current crisis.
The scholar Edwin Yamauchi summed up the entire debate with this one powerful question. Is it genuine prophecy, written beforehand, or is it prophecy written after the event? That is the choice that confronts every single reader of this ancient text. And that leaves us with a final question for you to think about. Whether it's divine prophecy or a political masterpiece, the Book of Daniel is undeniably a work of immense power. But how does understanding this deep-seated historical controversy, the story behind the story, change the way you read it today?